Welcome back to Forza Horizon 5, and this is going to be an interesting one because in this video, we are going to be sticking a 6.7-liter PowerStroke diesel engine into a classic Ford Mustang and attempting to turn it into a somewhat effective drift car. Now, you may be surprised at how many vehicles they actually let you swap that 6.7-liter diesel engine into in Horizon 5. You can swap it into so many different vehicles, ranging from classic muscle cars to modern trucks to off-road vehicles to just about almost anything you can think of. Not quite everything in the game, obviously, but there have been multiple occasions where I have been very surprised by a vehicle that would actually allow me to swap the 6.7-liter diesel into it. Now, obviously, this swap is what you might call a on-brand swap because we're swapping a Ford engine into another Ford. However, when you start to cross brand lines with engine swaps, that's always fun because, like, some people love it and other people get really annoyed because they're like, oh, you're not allowed to put that engine into that car. And I'm like, oh, but yes. Yes, indeed I am. Now, as you can see, we went through some of the other engine swap options for this particular Mustang, but we decided to go with the 6.7-liter V8 turbo diesel, and I decided to leave this car rear-wheel drive. Now, some of you may think that that was a mistake, and it probably was, but you know what? I figured it would be more fun that way, and I also felt like it would be more in the spirit of not only the original Mustang itself, but also in the spirit of keeping it rear-wheel drive for the purpose of drifting. Now, I know that there are obviously all-wheel drive drift builds out there, and I'm also aware that on average they do score more, but this car I was building more for the fun of actually driving it than the aspect of, you know, going leaderboard hunting with this car. That was not the purpose of this car in any way, shape, or form. Now, regardless of your opinions on the 6.7-liter diesel, I can guarantee you that you're going to be making so much torque that, A, you could move a planet, and B, you're almost never going to have any traction in almost any gear, well, unless you gear your car to the equivalent of, like, a 747 aircraft. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, that's up in the air. That's up to you to decide. But let me know in the comment section down below what vehicles you plan on swapping the 6.7-liter diesel into, or which vehicles you may have already swapped it into. Now, back into the build at hand. We've already got this thing lowered down. We pretty much actually got it just about slammed. And when I went to pick a transmission, I was going back and forth. I was kind of all over the place on which one to pick. And I was like, I wanted a little bit of a balance of having more gears and then also not necessarily having too many. And that's why I went with the 8-speed. The 8-speed seems to be, at least in my opinion, it seems to be a really good balance between, you know, having enough extra gears to extract maybe a little bit of extra power or a little bit of extra gear range, but it's also not so many that you end up getting jumbled up like I find myself doing with the 10-speed. The 10-speed is definitely an interesting beast to use, and it's certainly an interesting beast to tune. If you're trying to tune the 10-speed, you better have your formula down, otherwise you're going to make your gearbox a bit of a mess, and you're gonna make your gear ratios a bit of a mess because trying to line up 10 individual gears together to actually work with each other rather than fight against each other is kind of a job in and of itself. Now, while I wanted to go up a little bit in terms of wheel size, I didn't want to go up too much, just enough to where it would bring kind of that modern flavor out in the look of the car just a little bit. I know that some people like the really, really small wheels, especially on some of these older muscle cars, but I think this size kind of reaches a happy medium between that modern look and that classic look. Now, I was going back and forth between a lot of different wheel choices, and I'm talking a lot. I mean, it took me a while to pick wheels for this car because I could not decide whether I wanted to go modern or old school, and I'll let you guys wait and see which direction I ended up deciding to go, but I think we made a pretty good choice. And after going through all of my different options, it had to be the American Racing wheels. It really did. And I thought that it did a nice job of being just modern enough while also preserving just enough of the classic flair to not make it look too over the top and crazy. Now, since this was a drift build and not necessarily a circuit build or a race build, I wasn't worried about having the front splitter on there, so I took the front crash beam off as well. Now, the rear crash beam, I was going back and forth on whether or not to leave it on, and I almost took it off, but at the end of the day, I left it on and then went back and took it off again because I figured, I was like, well, if I took the front off, I might as well take the rear one off. Otherwise, it's going to look lopsided and weird when you look at the back of the car versus the front of the car, and I didn't want the look of it to be unbalanced. Now, going through all of this and going ahead and installing it on the car, yes, it does cost a good bit in terms of credits to end up diesel swapping one of these old muscle cars, but as you're about to see, the giggle factor of driving one of these things is absolutely hilarious when you put an engine with this much torque in a car that's rear-wheel drive and weighs this little. I mean, it weighs practically nothing compared to the vehicle that it came out of. I mean, it came out of a Ford F-450, and it's going into a freaking 65 Mustang. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head what the weight difference is, but I can guarantee you it's at least a few thousand pounds, and that is incredibly significant. Now, I haven't fully settled on an alignment setup with this car that I truly love just yet. I did a quick alignment on it just to kind of, you know, bring it into the space of having a drift setup, but it is by no means refined. Now, I did try to fine-tune the diff just a little bit as well. I didn't necessarily want to go full lock, and sometimes I end up going full lock, sometimes I don't, but I backed it off just a tiny bit so I would have a starting point. Now, I know some people say, oh, just go full lock immediately, and you can if you really want to, but at the same time, there is a lot of fine-tuning to be had within the diff that I feel like people end up leaving on the table sometimes. Now, going through the color combinations, I was debating on whether or not I wanted to do like a special color or a design, or maybe like, you know, kind of one of the pre-made special paint jobs, and I decided I wanted to do a little bit of a color fade, and I was going back and forth between what colors I wanted, and it's weird because I ended up settling on a color that was almost a solid color, but not quite. But at the end of the day, I think it came out pretty nice. From there on, I wanted to go ahead and do a couple of little touches, nothing too crazy, nothing too over the top. Wanted to mess around with the wheel colors a little bit, and just if you guys did not know, you can also dive into the brake caliper colors as well and tune those, or I shouldn't say tune those, but paint those to whatever your personal taste may be. Now, leaving the garage for the very first time in the 6.7 Mustang, let me just go ahead and tell you that it is a burnout machine. I was barely even moving, and it was already, like, completely just obliterating the rear tires. This thing wants nothing more than to just do burnouts all day long. I'm doing a standing burnout in 4th gear, 5th gear, and it's not even remotely complaining. It's just chilling out right here doing a standing burnout because mad torque. That is all this thing cares about, is the amount of torque it has, genuinely, at the end of the day. So I decided I would go ahead and do a couple of laps around the festival area just to kind of get a feel for it. And, you know, this was kind of when I realized that putting this much torque through the rear tires of a car this light is probably one of the wackiest things you could possibly do. And in this state, you know, while it was a lot of fun, it certainly wasn't going to win any drift competitions. And in order to get any kind of like combination of grip and slip with a little bit of forward momentum, I had to be all the way in 8th gear. So I knew that I was gonna probably have to adjust the gearing at least a little bit. But in general, I figured that the car was off to a pretty good start. So I went into the tuning tab and started backing down that final drive again, more and more and more. I was like, I really wanted to develop a little bit more resistance in the differential and in the gearbox than the car had before, because it was just overpowering every single gear ratio that I had put in the thing. And I realized very quickly that it was going to take a little bit more than a small adjustment to get this thing to actually behave somewhat remotely close to the way I wanted it to behave. Now, it was still, you know, kind of roasting the tires off the second I got on the gas, but at the very least, I didn't have to be in 8th all the time to have somewhat of a manageable power drift. Now, merging back here onto the bridge, it was so interesting to me driving this car, because driving a car with this much low-end torque, especially when it's a diesel swapped into a smaller sports car like this, you start to have to drive it in different ways. You're not always wanting to hang out at the rev limit. You're kind of wanting to keep your revs lower because that's where your power band is. That's where all of your torque is kind of in the low to mid-range RPM rather than up at the high end. And that is always a weird thing to have to remind yourself of, really with any drift car, but especially, you know, in Forza in general. I feel like so many of us that drift are used to spending a lot of time way up at the top of the rev range. I mean, heck, especially if you have a lot of rotary drift cars, oh my god, you're going to be spending all of your time, all of it, on the rev limiter. This, you want to kind of stay off of it, and as odd as that sounds, your power will start to kind of drain away the longer you stay on the rev limiter. Now, if you can keep it a little bit below the rev limit, that's still a really good area of the power band to be in. But that low to mid-range has so much extra torque that you don't have to downshift mid-drift anywhere near as much as you would in a typical gasoline-powered engine, as opposed to this diesel engine, for example. Now, will this be an effective combination in, let's say, a competitive mindset? I'm not completely sure on that yet. I'll have to really use this thing in a few drift zones and use it in some actual competitive ways to see how it actually stacks up against sort of like, you know, your general typical drift builds. But, you know, when I would compare it to some of the other drift builds that I've done, I would say it feels good, but it needs a lot of refinement. It needs a lot of work. And I think at the end of the day, it's still going to be a really fun car to drive and a really fun project to work with over time, and a really fun project to continue to fine-tune as I go along. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video and enjoyed this build, please do let me know any thoughts and opinions that you guys may have in the comment section down below. Let me know if you've attempted any builds like this one, or if this video made you want to attempt a build like this one. Either way, that's gonna do it for this video, y'all, and I will see y'all in the next one. Talk to y'all later.